welcome to A Coffee and Hardtack, a digital program by the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin. This is a bi-weekly program that has us interviewing Civil War historians and educators from around the U.S. and today, kind of beyond that. I'm Jenn Edginton. I'm curator of social studies education here at the Kenosha Museum campus in the Civil War Museum. And with me, as always, is Doug Dammann, who's the manager of the education department and curator of the Civil War Museum. And we're very excited for our special guest. It's 9 a.m. here. It is not 9 a.m. where you are. So thank you so much for joining us. Our special guest today is Dr. David Silkenat. So thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Perfect. So first things first, can you tell us about yourself?
Oh, sure. I'm David Silkenat. I'm a senior lecturer in American history at the University of Edinburgh. If I focus on the Civil War era, I've written a couple of books, most recently a book called Raising the White Flag, How Surrender Defined the American Civil War. And I'm also chair of the Scottish Association for the Study of America, which is a scholarly organization designed for Scottish historians and other people who study the United States in some context to work together and collaborate. So I teach here, live and teach in Edinburgh, Scotland. So yes, it is not 9 a.m. here. It's 3 in the afternoon.
It might be similar weather, though. It's kind of rainy and gross out today.
Thus far, Scotland looks okay, but wait 5 minutes and the weather will change.
So David, with teaching U.S. history at a university in Scotland, what is the level of interest in the Civil War there amongst your students? And how do you engage your students in the American Civil War in Scotland?
So American history generally is extraordinarily popular here, both at the University of Edinburgh and across Scotland. I think our students are very international. We have obviously a large number of students from Scotland, but from all over Britain and from other parts of the world, including lots of students from the United States. But American history has always been a field within history that has attracted a lot of interest. I think part of it is because the themes that our students are interested in are themes that are really sort of well represented in American history. They're interested in questions about race. They're interested in questions about class and gender, and they're interested in they've seen lots of America on TV growing up. So they have an interest in what makes American history tick, and so we've never really had a huge problem attracting students to American history courses. They always fill up. And Civil War courses are very popular, in part because it does sort of touch on these major themes that students are interested in. And so I teach undergraduate courses and graduate level courses on the American Civil War, and they're always full. So, it's a very popular topic. It's something that I think they connect a lot with.
Right.
So,
one of the things that we're working on here at the museum is an upcoming exhibit on the immigrant soldier who served in the Union Army. And I think a lot of people are surprised to learn that 25% of the Union Army was comprised of immigrants from foreign countries. And that's going to be one of the major themes of that exhibit. Are there Civil War sites or memorials that you know of in the UK or more local?
Well, there are tons. But I'll just tell you about the ones that are actually in Edinburgh, so within walking distance of where I am right now. There's the Scottish American Civil War Monument, which is located on Calton Hill Cemetery. It's right in the middle of town. It's a monument to the Scottish soldiers who fought in the American Civil War. In particular, a handful of them who were born in Scotland, fought, and then returned to Scotland. And a couple of them are actually buried at the monument. And it was dedicated in 1893. And it's an enormous statue of Abraham Lincoln. It resembles in many ways the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C., which has had some recent controversies about it. It has a similar composition because it has a formerly enslaved person who is positioned in a subordinate position to Lincoln on the statue. which is a problematic composition, but one that it shares with the Emancipation Memorial. So we have that monument, and that's really one of the few monuments to the war itself. There's several statues of Lincoln, obviously, all over the around the world, but this is one that actually is about the war and the soldiers who fought in it. There's also a monument. We have also a Confederate monument in town. There was a young man by the name of Robert Smith, who was from Edinburgh, who went and fought for the Confederacy, died in 1862. And his brother put up a monument to him. And it's actually maintained, I believe, by the Sons of Confederate Veterans. So we've got a very large Union monument and a somewhat smaller Confederate monument. But really, if you go throughout town there, you'll find lots of places where the Civil War is referenced. Frederick Douglass, for instance, lived here for a period of time, actually just basically around the corner from where I live. And there's a plaque showing where Frederick Douglass lived. So even several thousand miles away, the Civil War is not very far away at all.
That's true. That's what we get a lot with even the upper Midwest. Why do we have a Civil War museum up here when nothing's being fought in Kenosha, Wisconsin? Well, there's many
lots of soldiers from Wisconsin.
Exactly. And we focus on the 7 states. So that's a huge chunk of the Union Army.
Yeah. And there are lots of Scots who fought for both the Union and Confederate Army. If you think actually about it, if you sort of expand it to include not only immigrants, but people who are of Scottish descent, half of the Union and Confederate command is made up of people who have Scottish names. Make of that what you will. But, McDowell, McClellan, Burnside, Grant, Jackson on down the line. You do have a small number of units that are sort of associated with being Scottish units, the same way you have Irish regiments and German regiments. Probably the most famous is the 79th New York Regiment, which for a very brief period of time wore kilts. Right. And so we have this image of what a Civil War soldier looked like, but they, especially early in the war, they didn't all look the same. And some of them were wearing kilts, had bagpipes, the whole deal.
We have a couple of artifacts from the 12th Illinois. I think they were a predominantly Scottish regiment, and some of the men actually wore cams in lieu of forage caps or hardee hats. So we have a few pieces in our collection here that's associated with that regiment, the 12th Illinois.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. Well, I know this story we could talk about Scots and the Army for a very long time, but I do want to talk about your newest book, The Raising the White Flag, because it was really interesting. I really enjoyed reading it, and I learned so much. And one of the facts that you covered almost at the beginning is that 1 in 4 soldiers surrendered, making this the most common in military experiences, which that fact just kind of blew my mind. So could you elaborate a little bit more on just that statement and the experience of the soldiers that surrender was so prevalent in their life?
Right. Well, so the book began with a sort of very simple idea, and that is that people surrendered a lot in the Civil War, right? The war begins with a surrender at Fort Sumter. It ends with a series of surrender at Appomattox Courthouse and Bennett Place, and a dozen more afterwards. And in between, lots of the major events in the war are surrenders, right? So if you think about the turning points in the war, Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, and there's dozens more in the middle of the war where it ends in a surrender. And so the book was an effort really to try to sort of make sense of why do people surrender so much? What does that mean about the sort of nature of the war that happened? That surrender was this really defining feature from the very beginning through the very end. And what does it mean for the soldiers who are surrendering? One of the things that the book talks about, some of the surrenders are surrenders that are happening because the commanding officer is choosing to surrender. And sometimes, about half the time, in fact, soldiers are choosing to surrender on their own. In the middle of a battle, soldiers are throwing down their guns, raising their arms and saying, yelling that I surrender. And this was really very common, and so it was more soldiers surrendered than died in the Civil War, right? So we think about how important death was as a phenomenon. Well, I want to make sense, say, what happens when we look about the people who chose not to fight, chose to lay down their arms, and what does that mean? And so the book really began from that very basic premise, trying to sort of make sense of what was the thinking that went into both, the officers making choices about surrendering their command, and for individual soldiers, what went into what they think about the choice to surrender. And the argument I make in the book is that for most soldiers, they didn't see surrender as something that was dishonorable. They saw surrender as something that was an entirely legitimate choice to make given certain circumstances. And one of the things that struck me really very early on when I was just sort of conceptualizing the book is that they had a very different understanding of what surrender meant than Americans do in the 20th century and the 21st century. There's this idea that Americans never surrender. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy, has this famous thing where he goes on TV and he says, there's one choice Americans will never make, and that is the choice of surrender. And that's an idea that Americans have articulated in a variety of different ways, really throughout recent American history. Not only did Kennedy say it, Nixon said it, Reagan said it, Clinton said it, Obama said it. George W. Bush said it. Actually, both Bushes said it. Obama, and these are people who don't agree on much of anything else. But they seem to say Americans never surrender. But on the other hand, we have this event in the defining event in American history, at least to my way of thinking, in which people are surrendering all the time. And so their understanding is, they're seeing surrender in a very different way. And so part of what I was trying to do in the book is to sort of make sense of what were the rules that they understood surrender through.
David, as you said, the war really began with a surrender at Fort Sumter and ended, not, most people, would argue that, or not, would argue that, or who don't, I guess the common perception is the war ended at Appomattox, right? But we know there were other very large efforts still in the field there. Can you talk about maybe the stigma of surrender? How did it evolve throughout the war? I mean, you have Robert Anderson and his troops at Fort Sumter. Is there a different attitude that you see develop throughout the 4 years? Did it kind of ebb and flow, or what did you find in your research?
Well, so Robert Anderson and Fort Sumter is a really interesting story because I think that sort of set the template for most of the rest of the war. And I think as most people watching this know, Robert Anderson commands this very small garrison at Fort Sumter in the middle of Charleston Harbor, and he's there for a series of months while South Carolina and then Confederate forces are surrounding him. So he's vastly outnumbered. And Beauregard makes repeated demands that he abandon Fort Sumter and surrender, and he refuses. Beauregard ends up firing on Fort Sumter, and after 34 hours and really sort of a devastating bombardment, Anderson surrenders. And he and his men are allowed to depart from Fort Sumter, and they go up to New York. What people, I think most people know that story. What people don't know about that story is when he gets to New York, they are greeted as heroes because he surrendered on the right terms, right? He was under fire. He had no opportunity to sort of strategically retreat, and continuing to fight would have meant just that he and his soldiers would have died. And the sort of rubric and this is a rubric that was, I think, shared by both armies, was that if you faced fire and realized that surrender was the only, that you couldn't win, you couldn't retreat, that this was an entirely legitimate, if not legitimate, honorable thing to do. This was sort of the way in which a civilized army fights. You surrender, the enemy accepts your surrender, and you treat the person who is surrendering with dignity. So Confederates allowed him to leave, and he's treated as a hero. And if you look, at the end of the war, at Robert E. Lee, he leaves Appomattox Courthouse, not, with his reputation among his soldiers actually probably improved. Right? They love him even more the day after he surrendered than the day he surrendered. So there's a very common sort of rubric that really runs throughout the war. There's an event that actually happens. You mentioned that there's Appomattox Courthouse is often seen as the end, and in some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. But there are a series of surrenders that happened afterwards. And one of the last people to surrender is Edmund Kirby Smith, who is in charge of the Trans-Mississippi Department. He's basically out in Texas by himself for most of the second half of the war. And after basically everyone else has surrendered, the U.S. Army sends a delegate out to him, asking him if he wants to surrender. And he thinks about it for a bit and comes back and he says, "No, I don't want to surrender." And the union representative says, "Well, I need more than that. Can you tell me why?" And he writes this very lengthy letter. And he basically says, "I can't surrender yet because you guys haven't fired upon me yet. Like, there are rules that are sort of established about when you can surrender, when you can't, and we haven't met that threshold yet." I mean, he's under no illusion that if that fighting happened, that he would win. But he has a very well established paradigm of when you can surrender and when you can't. And that really holds true for both armies for the pretty much the entire war. And there are a couple of cases where people surrender prematurely, and those are treated very harshly. And there are other groups that people, especially Confederates, believe can't surrender, right? This is the case for African American soldiers, where Confederates say they don't recognize them as legitimate soldiers, and so there are a number of occasions, probably most famously at Fort Pillow, in which African American soldiers try to surrender and are refused that option, which is, well, it's given to white soldiers. So there's ways in which surrender is shaped, like everything else in the Civil War, by questions about race and slavery. Yeah.
That's really interesting, especially looking at it in the context of, racial inequities too. It's really, really interesting. I know because you and I have talked about this, but we're in the upper Midwest, and there is one story that I saw and it caught my eye when reading your book, and that is the story of Camp Douglas. And
sure.
So would you mind talking a little bit about the story of Camp Douglas and the Harpers Ferry connection there too?
Oh, sure. So Camp Douglas is a very interesting site in the south side of Chicago. It's basically, I think, on like 30th Street, sort of like where Kaminsky Park was, head a little bit east. That's where it is. And it served several different functions during the Civil War. At one point, it's a training camp. It's also a POW camp. So the people who surrendered at Fort Donelson are sent to Camp Douglas. But it's also what is known as a parole camp, and I think that's the story you're talking about. And to make sense of what a parole camp is, and how people from Harpers Ferry end up there, I sort of have to backtrack a little bit to the summer of 1862. Because then the Union Confederate governments came to an agreement about what to do about prisoners of war called the Dix Hill Cartel. And this was an agreement, basically, that neither side really wanted to hold prisoners of war. And what they would do instead of holding people in prisoner of war camps is that they would exchange prisoners. And it's a two-part process. The first part of the process is that if you are captured or if your officer surrenders you, you are paroled within 10 days. And what a parole was a piece of paper where you sign it and you say, "I pledge not to fight until I have been notified that I've been exchanged for a soldier on the other side." And so what happens then is you have this, after the Dix Hill Cartel is made, prison camps largely empty. The people who were in Camp Douglas as prisoners of war, they all get to go home. But depending on the balance of prisoners between the two sides, the length of time between when you are paroled and when you are exchanged could actually be a very long time. And so what was happening is some soldiers would get paroled and they would go home. Because where else they're going to go? They said they're not going to fight, so they go home. And during that particular summer, there was a situation in which there were a lot more Union soldiers being taken prisoner than were Confederates, and so there were a lot more people on parole. And there were people who were concerned about this for two reasons. One is they were concerned that people were getting themselves captured intentionally so they could go home. Doesn't seem to be any evidence that people were actually doing that. But the bigger problem was that once people went home, getting them to come back to the regiment can be a bit tricky. You got to go find them. You got to tell them to come in, and there were logistical issues. So their solution were parole camps, which were basically, they were like POW camps, except you are being held by your own government until you've been exchanged for a soldier on the other side. And a lot of the soldiers who end up in Camp Douglas and as a parole camp were people who were surrendered at Harpers Ferry. And Harpers Ferry is the largest Union surrender of the war. It's part of the Antietam, the Maryland campaign in 1862. Lee sends Stonewall Jackson over to capture Harpers Ferry, which is commanded by a man named Dixon Miles, who was arguably one of the worst commanders in the Union Army. His major redeeming feature was that he was in the Army for a long time, managed not to get kicked out of it. He was both an alcoholic and something of a coward. He surrenders his garrison of 12,000 men basically just as the fighting begins. And his garrison included lots of soldiers who had basically just enlisted and just been issued their rifles. So men who had actually never seen combat, never fired their weapons, never really had an opportunity to prove themselves. And here they are being surrendered by the commanding officer. And several of these regiments are from upstate New York, probably most famously the 126th New York, which then gets sent to Camp Douglas in Chicago. And they are rightly, I guess, frustrated by the whole situation. They want to fight their country. They want to do all those things. And they end up not being able to fight for their country and being stuck in Chicago, and they say, are we being held prisoner here? And the people would say, no, you're not really being held prisoner. And they say, well, can we leave? They said, no, you can't leave. And so they were, as you can imagine, they found this immensely frustrating. And at one point, the Army threatens to send them into Minnesota and the Dakota territories, where this is during the Dakota War of 1862. And the soldiers there say, look, we promised not to fight. Our piece of paper said we're not going to fight. And, these paroles that people sign, you think it's very strange, you're going to let an enemy go. They took these very seriously. And they said, no, when we said we're not going to fight, we're not going to fight anybody until we are exchanged. But there are riots that break out in Camp Douglas because the people are upset. That regiment, though, ends up redeeming itself, if that's the right word. They end up, after they get exchanged after a few months in Camp Douglas, and they end up fighting at Gettysburg. And they end up actually fighting against some of the same people they surrendered to at Harpers Ferry. And so, that's a really interesting case about how surrender works, because, here are soldiers who wanted to fight but end up not fighting and end up fighting at Gettysburg.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. I think another one that connects up very similarly to the upper Midwest is the 3rd Minnesota. They got surrendered, I believe, in Tennessee, and then they were sent back to Minnesota to fight in the Dakota War and the uprising there in Minnesota. So there's all these different layers to all of this and different decisions that are made. You're certainly correct on that. It's a fascinating part of the larger story that I don't think a lot of people are aware of.
To be sure.
Yeah, and David, to that end, any other recommendations besides your book, of course, that people could look into, that if they're interested in learning more about either prisoner of war camps, the experiences of the paroled soldiers, anything that you know of that you can point them in?
The problem with being a Civil War historian is that there are so many good books that come out every month that keeping up is nearly impossible. So I'll recommend a few different kinds of things that have all come out in the past couple of years that people might want to take a look at. One is a book by Stephanie Jones Rogers called They Were Her Property, which was released, I believe, last year, which is really an extraordinary book about how white women in the South were sort of active enslavers, right? We often sort of think about slavery as being something where men are slaveholders and women are, sort of in a secondary position. And there's a question about sort of what's the relationship with white women and slavery. And this is a book that very powerfully argues that white women in the South were very active in maintaining the institution of slavery and engaging in all kinds of cruelty towards enslaved people. A very different book is Amy Muriel Taylor's Embattled Freedom, which is about contraband camps during the Civil War. So they're looking at African Americans who are refugees during the Civil War and established what were known as, at the time, as contraband camps. And there were dozens of these, really. Anywhere the Union Army was, there's usually a contraband camp right next door. And these were really interesting locations to look at, in terms of these are places where African Americans are exercising freedom for the first time. But they're also refugee camps and have all the problems that refugee camps have with overcrowding and disease. And so it's a really fascinating look at that. And the final book I want to recommend is a book by Adam Dombey called The False Cause, which is about how former Confederates in the decades after the Civil War not only sort of twisted the memory of the war, but actually sort of invented stuff, made stuff up to support their sort of political agendas in the post-war period. So I think, we all think about the ways in which the lost causes and ideology sort of distorts what the Civil War was about and the Civil War experience. Well, what Dombey looks at is really where the places where people are actually actively inventing things to create a sort of a false history to support the president they want to create. There are dozens of other books I could recommend, but those are the three that come to mind as things people should take a look at.
Perfect. Yeah, there's so many good Civil War books out right now. So yeah.
Yeah, and David, just to follow up on the Camp Douglas story, I do know there is an effort from a local group to try to create a museum, and they've done a lot of archaeological work there.
Yes,
I've
seen
on the ground. We actually have a few things on display about, 20, 30 feet from where Jen and I are sitting right now that were resulting of that archaeological work, and David Keller and his group are looking to do some additional interpretation there on the south side. So we hope that happens in the near future.
Yeah. I mean, the Civil War is everywhere if you look for it. You think you're in Chicago and that Civil War is something that happens far away in Virginia. It's not. It's something that happens in, it happens in Chicago. It happens in Kenosha. It happens, here in Scotland. So it's there if you look for it. Great point.
And kind of with that note, we will sign off for today. So thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And thank you for everyone for listening. We'll see you next time.